I am joined this morning by Darius Pocha. I hope I've got that correct, Darius, after asking you how to pronounce your name just before we started.
Perfect.
Thank you. Good, nailed it. Darius joins us from Create Change, and I'll take the words directly from your website, Darius, as well. So you help product and policy teams tackle population level problems through user-centered design, data, and technology. So what's a little bit about what you do in your own words? So how else would you build on that description to give another kind of version of what Create Change does?
Well, I think that says it, Lloyd. You know, we've Create Change was founded by myself and my business partner Mark Delgado. We help governments develop new policy and public services through, like you said, research, design, data and technology, and also by embedding digital ways of working. We have been, we founded the company about 5 years ago, and Mark and I at the time we both come into government. We were both working in interim leadership roles, both super inspired by what was going on. And it actually took us about a year to win our first piece of work with the Department for Education, which was in March 2018. So we've been sort of active just under 4 years. And since then, we've done about £10 million worth of work across education, health, social care, justice, and environment. So across about 7 or 8 government departments. And I suppose if our specialism is we're really good at sort of complex citizen-facing problems and helping major programs either get up and running or work better.
Okay, brilliant. And there's a few interesting things that I picked up there, and I spotted those the first time we talked as well. And the first one was this kind of in with government that you and your business partner, right? You were working as consultants to start off with. And I think the second thing with this was this idea of population level problems, which is the first time I'd ever kind of thought of or heard of a term like that, and how complex that is. So this is why this discussion, we're really going to focus on using kind of deep specialism and expertise to solve complex public sector problems, because I think that's really what you're talking about in a nutshell. So yeah, I really want to kind of dig down a little bit more on that. But just something I should have mentioned earlier as well is to kind of congratulate you guys on getting onto the Tussle Tech 200 list for the fastest growing technology company. So congratulations for that. I mean, that's really how we kind of came about talking. Incredibly impressive growth. You were talking about what you'd done previously. It was at 10 million, you said as the figure, but 450% growth year on year we had over that period. So whatever you're doing, you must be doing something right, which is why we're all ears, and we want to listen to exactly what you're saying. So we're talking about public sector, Darius, as well. So let's start off with kind of asking about how public sector differs from the private sector. So what is it? What are the kind of unique problems that we have in the public sector that you don't see necessarily mirrored exactly in the private sector?
Yeah. So my experience coming in was I'd been working in the private sector. I'd actually been doing a lot of, earlier on in my career, I did a lot of work with non-profits. I worked with all the big charities, Amnesty, Greenpeace, Oxfam, Red Cross, WWF, all of those guys. And found that work fulfilling, but ultimately quite frustrating, because you never, you know, there's the big charities often struggle to have impact on the big problems they're trying to tackle. And then after that, I ended up doing a lot of work in fashion and retail. And I woke up one morning and realized I just didn't really care. I didn't give a rat's ass whether I sold another pair of trainers this morning, you know. Yeah. And I was very inspired by the work that GDS were doing in government. And I thought, well, this that kind of public service work combines the sort of the values of doing the work with non-profits, but also you're kind of going to the source. It's government that often has the clout to actually do something about these big problems. You know? Yeah. So I was I was running an agency at the time, doing lots of fashion work, and on the Friday I was in Milan working with a bunch of people running around with their hair on fire because the wrong sneakers were on the website. And then Monday morning I found myself in a basement in Westminster looking at export licensing controls, because I just thought, I'm going to dive in, I'm going to put on a white belt, I'll actually go and do some practitioner work because I want to learn all about this. And my immediate my experience of that, my immediate reaction to it was, this is 10x harder than anything I've ever worked on in the private sector. So if you think about the things you might encounter if you're working in a private sector company, sometimes it might be high stakes. Occasionally there's massive public scrutiny. You've got sort of toxic legacy technology issues to deal with. Very occasionally, you might have the probability of being shouted out on the front page of the Daily Mail. That is a slow Tuesday in government, and in government, there are always multiple bottom lines to what you're doing as well. You've got lots and lots of different objectives that you've got to hit, and it's not just about ROI, it's not about conversion. And these are high stakes things. They're things that really matter. So the domains that we've worked in and had the sort of the privilege of helping government out on: justice, environment, education, health, social care. These are the big important things. So for that reason, I think it's very attractive to work with government, but also super challenging. And anybody sort of coming into this space shouldn't take that too lightly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really interesting, like focusing on the things that really matter. But there's a phrase that you used again, which I kind of honed in on last time we spoke to as well, and this idea about multiple bottom lines. So let's just dig into that for a second. What does that mean? I suppose when you're working for a private sector company, there's one bottom line that matters, right? It's about finances. It's about the money that you're bringing in for the business. So how do you think that's different than the public sector? What would those other bottom lines be that you have to be focused on? It's not just about making money or some return on some project, right? There's other considerations as well.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to think about if you're so some things that we do, like helping to shape policy or helping to make public services better. Sometimes cost is always important because it's taxpayers' money.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But being cheap isn't necessarily the best way to do that, because some things that policy and public services are trying to do are really expensive, and they're investments in the future. Or if you think of something like the sort of pandemic response, there's a critical problem that's got to be solved now. And in some cases, almost like no amount of money is too much because the need is so critical. Yeah. So you've got those immediate sort of citizen needs, but you've also got the government's there to shape policy and achieve things in the long term, and they're not necessarily the things that in the moment citizens want to do. So if you think about something like subsidies for renewables, citizens don't have an intrinsic need to reduce their carbon footprint. They might have they might have a sort of, they might think that's a nice thing to do and they might want to do it, but that on its own probably won't force the pace of change. Yeah. So sometimes you've got to, in fact, often actually, government has got to balance the things it wants to achieve in the long term and the things that citizens immediately need. And then there are other things as well. There are manifesto commitments. There are, there's navigating the way that the media perceives what government's doing. So all of these things, there can be very powerful stakeholders and lobbying groups. Yeah. So all of these things have got to be navigated.
Yeah.
And one of the things that public servants often have to do is they have to weigh all this stuff up and try and find a path through it. And as a supplier, it's often your job to ride shotgun with them and help them navigate that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you're talking about this multiple bottom lines. If you've got kind of media impact, you've got the balance and kind of politics manifesto pledges, all of those sorts of things. And again, it's kind of, I think that's almost part of the human condition, right? Do we know what's best for us in the long term? And what do we need in the short term that maybe wouldn't make commercial sense for a kind of, for a private sector organization? So yeah, that's really interesting to kind of understand that all of those things are competing at once that you might not have in the same way in the private sector. It makes sense.
Yeah, but one of the things we often say is that governments and other public institutions often get handed the hard jobs that nobody else wants to do.
Yeah,
and in the long run, those are some of the most important jobs to be done.
Of course. Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, look, and you talked about the pandemic as well. So let's just focus on that for a second. I mean, the pandemic's changed everything in the public sector, as we know. There's been massive focus on the COVID response, both kind of directly and indirectly. So how do you think the problems and kind of complexities of things have changed as a result of the pandemic, and how do you see that continuing or kind of changing back to how it was before?
Yeah, and I mean, the pandemic's an accelerant, isn't it? So over the last decade, governments around the world have been grappling with the way that citizens' expectations of public services have been raised by digital. And the pandemic has just further intensified that. So, so I think actually, this is a really important moment for governments and other public institutions, because if they can't meet those expectations, they're going to become less relevant. That's the danger. Okay. Citizens are increasingly expecting private sector companies to sort out the world's problems, whether it's health or education or transport or environment. And the problem is that those companies are driven by the needs of shareholders, not society. So I think one of even more so since the pandemic, governments need to bring their A game to service delivery.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Actually, the way you framed that, how much focus and pressure is on the government to do a good job, and obviously there's lots of things being put out in the press, negative and positive, but yeah, the heat is definitely on for those to deliver, and like you say, it's quite an interesting balance between those shareholder-driven kind of goals and aspirations for private sector firms being balanced against what does the government need them to do now. Okay, good. All right. Well, and also let's for the next question, let's go back to something you talked about before. This terminology about population level problems, because that's not. The first time we spoke, I'd never heard of this kind of as a term, and I just found it really interesting, right? Solving a problem for, if you went in as a consultant and tried to solve the problems of one organization or one group of people, that's hard enough. So what would you say your kind of top tips for solving population level problems? What do you need to do?
Well, I think the first thing is you should recognize that these problems are never solved. They tend to be unsolvable problems, and governments typically either make things better or they make things worse. And so I would say, number one, as a supplier, it's not your job to solve anything. You're there to help government, tackle, I would say, rather than solve these problems. But when you're talking about something that might impact millions of people, so let's when we were talking about difference between public and private sector, one of the things in the private sector that you can do, in fact you sort of have to do, is segment your audience and decide this is who we're going after. This is the person whose problem we're going to solve. If that's tens of millions of people, you just can't do that. You've got to tackle lots of different facets of a problem from lots of different points of view. And sometimes, but you've also got to be realistic about something. You're not going to solve this problem. Your job is to help government make this thing better, make the situation better than it is now. So often it's just focusing in on the thing that government has permission or leverage to really change.
Okay.
And I think for suppliers, when you're thinking about how you can help government do that, you've got to be very clear about the role that you're playing. What is the value you can bring? So typically, I think you're doing one of three things. You're supporting, in which case you need to be good value for money, you need to be flexible, you need to be easy to work with. You're accelerating what government's doing, in which case you really need to understand how government works. Going fast in government is hard, and if you don't have experience of navigating that, you'll just bounce off. And if you're enhancing what government does, that means you've got to bring insight or information or capability that government doesn't have or doesn't have yet. And I think as a supplier, you need to understand which of those you're doing at any given time, and you need to engineer your offering and your pricing and all the rest of it to suit that thing.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think just want to pick up on one thing you said there about just understanding government at large, right? Just understanding, if you've come in from the private sector, Cole, if you're new into the public sector, into working with government, what do you think people can do? Because when we talk about your story, we heard that you and your partner had worked in government before, right? So you'd had a little bit of an inside track. Have you got any tips for anybody who's never worked in the government before? How can you understand how government really works as an outsider? Is there things you can read, or where would you look to find that information if you were coming in cold?
I think my way into it was, like I said, I literally put on a white belt and decided to be a practitioner and go into a service team and learn it from the ground up.
Yeah.
And so I did that, and then quite quickly, the department I was working, which was Bays at the time, they asked me to be head of service design, the head of profession there, which is where I met Mark, my business partner. And I'm not sure, I think that grounding of having done that was really critical to us. And part of that actually is because I was talking about those three things: supporting, accelerating, or enhancing what government does. I think a lot of what we do is accelerating. And there you do need to understand how government works, because otherwise you can't help civil servants go faster. I think if you're supporting or enhancing, it's potentially less important, particularly if, and one of the things that we do actually is we often bid in consortium, and we often partner up with a specialist who can bring in some sort of capability or expertise that government doesn't have. And actually one of the things that we can bring to that is because we do have quite a lot of understanding of how government works, we can help with that bit. So a really good example actually is we did a piece of work for Department for Education, which was looking at policy around online training for low-skilled adults. And we partnered up with Open University and a edtech startup called Century. And between the three of us, we could supply lots of different specialisms, and for us, we were supplying knowledge of how government works and how government designs and develops services. And OU and Century were bringing their domain expertise to it. So that might be, if you've never worked with government before, that might be a way to do it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, bringing those individual bits of specialism or domain expertise. I think we speak about that a lot. And there's kind of two things, actually, Darius, just want to pick up on what you said. But if I can kind of reframe what you were saying, it feels like it's almost saying there's no shortcuts, right? There's no shortcuts to this stuff. The way that you did it, if you really want to understand how government works, you've got to throw yourself in there, and you've got to be willing to learn. And that definitely resonates with us in terms of what we've learned about working with government, or taking government data. But also the other thing about working in collaboration with others, consortium bidding or finding a partner to bid with is such a powerful way to do it. So it's really interesting to hear that you say that's kind of part of how you've had success as well. Okay, good. So look, let's kind of pivot a little bit to the role of data, which is obviously something which is very close to our hearts. But how have you, what do you see as the role in data in solving these kind of public sector problems, and how do you use it to create change?
Well, I mean, it flows through everything. I think the thing that has changed for us significantly in the last 2 years is historically let's take an example, which, for instance, when you're helping either a policy team formulate policy or a service team think about how best to develop and land their service. Sort of historically, what government's done is it's looked at big quantitative sources of data and done economic or business analysis of that data, but traditionally static data. Mm-hmm. And then really in the last sort of 6-7 years, since GDS happened, there's been an increased awareness of and kind of capability being built in government around qualitative user research, which is much smaller scale, but gives you much more texture about what's actually happening on the ground and whether what you're doing is really meeting people's needs. The thing that's really changed over the last 2 years, and we've actually started to do significantly more of, is when you've got big data that is not static, and it's either unstructured or it's structured, but it's so fast moving, or there's so much of it that you can't do traditional quant analysis. So we've been doing an increasing amount of data science and applied AI work. So we've that either feasibility or actually making proofs of concept. And that might be because you've got something like a big corpus of documents you need to extract information from. So you might need something like natural language processing, or you might have a lot of quant data from services, but it's a big pipe of data, and you're trying to combine insights from lots of different things, in which case you might need a data science approach. So that's been the big change for us, I would say, and I think that's set to continue in government. And I think that is where the magic will happen, actually, in terms of insight. This mix of traditional quant analysis, fast-moving, small-scale qualitative research, and data science and applied AI techniques to wrangle just the explosion of data that is available to government.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that. It's just this kind of, you get this deluge of data, right? And it gets to a certain point where how useful can it be unless you can structure what you need and break it down into the areas that are most useful for you. And then, like you're saying, the qualitative part of that analysis to work in conjunction with the quantitative kind of aspect to get the answers that you need. But yeah, definitely something that resonates as well, just kind of sheer volume. It's understanding what really matters and what is going to help government solve those problems.
Yeah, and I think that bit of trying to understand what matters is often a triangulation of these different types of data. So, a large quant measure might tell you about, let me give you an example, actually. So I mentioned that we were doing this piece of work for Department for Education around online training for low-skilled adults. So quant data will tell you something like which region you've got most people in where the jobs they're in are declining, but other jobs that they could get into are rising. So you can sort of see a potential skills transfer need. And you might get very large scale employment data from job sites. Mm-hmm. And that will tell you other dimensions, like how often people are moving jobs and, you know, what things are being asked for most often. Yep. What it won't tell you is what it's like to actually be that person. So sometimes you need to, in fact, always, I would say, you need to go talk to that person, find out what's going on in their lives, what sort of challenges they have, what kind of technology they've got access to. So it is that triangulation of all these different data types that are going to tell you what matters.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Triangulation of data. I like that as a concept, and also, yeah, that's kind of for me, it's almost a little bit of the story behind the data, right? The data's telling you something, but it's the kind of why, what's underneath that, and what's causing it. Yeah. Okay. Really, really, really interesting. Next question I'm going to ask you. It goes back to the point that we were talking about at the beginning, and that's something you mentioned previously. This kind of the scalpel versus the sledgehammer. So being really being a real specialist when kind of selling to the public sector or helping them solve problems. Why do you feel that kind of doubling down within a specialism has worked for you versus going broad? Because you could have a strategy which says you go and just try and attack all departments in all areas of government. So why do you feel like this kind of specialist approach has worked well for Create Change?
Well, every supplier I know that is good, in fact, pretty much every company I know that is good at any scale, doubles down on doing one or two things exceptionally well. And, you know, no company is great at everything. If you want, so if I talk about us, you know, if you need a big cloud technology transformation, that's not us. We would have to partner with somebody to do that, and we would have to bring some, you know, we'd have to bring our thing to that to bring value, really. So our thing, like we talked about, is tackling these sort of hard citizen-facing problems and helping government go faster. By concentrating on that, we've become more credible at that, because we can show, you know, we win more of that stuff, then we can show a better track record. And I suppose particularly for smaller firms or younger firms who want to, you know, build this footprint in the public sector, I think that, you know, there are two things that are really critical. So one is building credibility, and the other is focus, and the two are, you know, interrelated. So the bottom line is public servants are under a lot of scrutiny, and they're spending taxpayers' money. So they are not going to take a chance on you, and they shouldn't. You know, you've got to be able to prove that you can deliver, and this is very hard stuff to do well. So understanding what you're great at is really important, and then just consistently delivering on it and building great relationships, because you need to build trust. And then I think this thing of focus, where you understand whether you're supporting, accelerating, or enhancing what government does, is really important, because the chances are you're not going to be brilliant at all three of those things, and all three of them require different, you know, they're bought in a different way, they require you to deliver in a different way, they're often at different price points. So I think if we try to go super broad and try and tackle every piece of work that was available, what we would not do, we just waste our effort, and we wouldn't do that thing that you've got to do of just getting continually better at what you do and continually more credible.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like that, because there's kind of this. You're almost talking about this snowball effect, right? Where you realize what you're good at, you do more of that, you gain credibility, trust. You kind of close the trust gap. You then you win more of that work. You get even more credibility, and it kind of builds. It's like a virtuous kind of cycle that keeps building your this credibility and trust in your organization. And that's and also focusing on things. Certainly at Tussle, we found that. I think where we found success is where we've kind of where we've focused on less. We're more focused on kind of fewer activities, and that's really helped us. It suddenly becomes more about what you don't do than what you do.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And it's like I said at the top, it took us a year to win our first piece of work. And I think one thing that surprised me a bit when I was used to, when I was working in the private sector, or even not-for-profits as well, same thing, you would go and pitch and you would do your jazz hands. And if you were good, somebody would say, yeah, we're going to take a bet on these people. Highly unlikely that will happen in government.
Okay.
It's a much more slow thinking type process. Just because, like I said, public servants are under scrutiny and it's taxpayers' money, it sort of should be like that. So probably I would say, actually, don't be discouraged if you don't start winning work straight away, but do try and understand why that isn't happening. And I think it's really critical to understand what it is, what your value is, how it is you're going to help government, how you plug into what government needs. And I do think a lot of suppliers spend an awful lot of time thinking about what they want to sell rather than what is actually needed for public organisations. So yeah, that would be my advice, I think.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, I think that's a really good. I think that's a really good note to end on, Darius. I think it's been it's really interesting discussion with you. I can try and summarise, and I'll probably do it quite badly, with some of the things we talked about that I think were really important. We talked about multiple bottom lines and the different priorities that government is facing that are different in the private sector organisation. I think you spoke about support, enhance, or accelerate. I think there were the three things that you said. Which of those three are you doing as an organisation, and understanding where you fit? And also, there's something in there about patience, right? And this kind of trust gap, and being quite focused on government, what government really needs, not what you want to sell. So I think all of those things being brought together, I think there's some really fantastic advice there for others to take away. So I just wanted to say thank you again, Darius, for coming on. Congratulations again on your place on the Tussle Tech 200. You've done a fantastic job in getting there, and yeah, we'll speak again soon.
All right, thanks, Lloyd. Good to speak.
Cheers, bye.
Bye.